Welcome to Sex Talk Radio, a podcast that explores kink and sex through candid and curious conversations. Join me and expert guests in exploring taboos and unpacking what it means to be sex and kink positive. Go check out our new website, sextalkradio.com. That is SEGGS talkradio.com. And I hope you enjoy the episode.
Our fantasies also change over the course of our lives. But yeah, I find that about half of people say that they've shared their favorite fantasy, but among those who have not, shame, guilt, embarrassment, fear, anxiety, like there's a lot of negative emotions that bubble up that prevent people from ever talking about these fantasies with their partners.
I'm so excited to introduce you guys to Butter. Butter Wellness makes external prostate massagers for men. They're extremely high-powered, no insertion necessary, and they give really incredible prostate orgasms. You can get 20% off by going to butterwellness.com and use code SEXS, S-E-G-G-S. Over 80% of women, including myself, cannot have orgasms from penetrative sex alone. That is why it is so important that we find sex toys that we love. Honey Playbox makes an incredibly wide variety of toys. They literally have it all. They have wands, they have clit suckers, they have thrusting toys. They have so many options. And what's really cool about Honey Playbox is they're very technology forward. Many of their toys can be app controlled in addition to the regular settings and buttons on the toy, which makes it really fun for you and your partner. Go to honeyplaybox.com and use code SEXS, S-E-G-G-S, for 20% off of your entire order. This episode of Sex Talk Radio is brought to you by the HUD app. The HUD app is changing the face of modern and casual dating by giving users a really fun and flirty interface, and also it has bedroom features where you can select all of the kinky and naughty things you're into and show those to potential future partners. I personally love using the HUD app, and I think it's a great system for finding kinky people near you. Go to hudapp.com/sextalk. That is hudapp.com/SEGGS talk, TALK, for more. One of the many things that I love about Mochi Melt is that it is an overall luxury experience using it. It tastes delicious and it looks gorgeous on the nightstand. If you want to try out Mochi Melt for yourself, go to mochimelt.com and use code Thea, THEA, for 15% off of your entire order. I recently squirted for the first time and it was a lot of liquid. That's why I'm so glad that I've since found Splash Blanket. They create incredible waterproof blankets for all types of fluids. They have them in a bunch of different sizes and textures, and they are truly incredible and very absorbent. Go to splashblanket.us and use code SEGGS for 15% off of your entire order. All right. Dr. Justin Lehmiller, welcome to Sex Talk Radio.
Thanks for having me on the show.
We are in Indiana, which I'm super excited to be here, interviewing some of the amazing researchers at the Kinsey Institute. And why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, I am Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow here at the Kinsey Institute. I also run the Sex and Psychology blog and podcast, and I write books. I serve as an expert witness in sex crime cases.
Oh, wow.
I talk a lot to the media about all things sex and publish a lot of sex research. So every day is a little bit different in my office.
Wow. I love that. Can you tell me a little bit about your most recent book?
My most recent book is called Tell Me What You Want, and it's all about the science of sexual fantasies. So for that book, I interviewed 4,175 Americans. Well, I should say I surveyed 4,175 Americans. I didn't talk to them all personally.
Yeah.
But I asked them about their favorite sexual fantasy of all time, as well as hundreds of people, places, and things they might have ever fantasized about, and then wrote a whole book about the findings, looking at what it is that we fantasize about, where our fantasies come from, and what you need to know if you're thinking about sharing or acting on your fantasies.
Yeah, one of the big themes, it seems like, in the book, and I've also just come across this like in a lot of conversations with people in the sex space, is that not sharing it or the secrecy can have the shame and guilt grow more for the person.
And that absolutely does happen. in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
I find that only about half of adults say that they've ever shared their favorite fantasy of all time. I was actually surprised that it was that high, that as many as 50% had.
Their favorite or like their naughty?
Their favorite fantasy.
Huh,
so
okay.
I asked a lot of in-depth questions about
Sure.
people's favorite fantasy, their sort of go-to one.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to recognize that that can change. You know, what your favorite
Totally.
fantasy is at 20 might be very different from 30 or 40 or 50. Our
Yeah.
fantasies also change over the course of our lives. But yeah, I find that about half of people say that they've shared their favorite fantasy. But among those who have not, shame, guilt, embarrassment, fear, anxiety, like there's a lot of negative emotions that bubble up that prevent people from ever talking about these fantasies with their partners.
And those on that side were dramatically higher for those emotions, people that hadn't shared.
Yes. So for people who hadn't shared, when their favorite fantasy came to mind, they were more likely to report negative emotions and they reported fewer positive emotions.
Wow.
And so it starts to get in the way of their ability to not just enjoy the fantasy, but also to communicate about it or act on it with a partner. And sometimes the anxiety is so strong that people will never share their fantasies with a partner or only after years or maybe even decades together. You know, it's not uncommon for a kink or a fetish to only come out 20 years into a marriage, and then that becomes a whole other thing.
I was just going to say, that's a whole other thing.
Because when it's been secret for so long, then people start to feel betrayal. Why did you keep this from me? I don't think I even know who you are anymore. And that's a whole other thing.
Absolutely. You talk a lot about the difference between like a fantasy and the actual experience. I think that's a super important distinction. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So I like to distinguish between sexual fantasy, sexual desire, and sexual behavior.
Okay.
So a fantasy is just an arousing thought or mental image that turns you on. A desire is a wish or a want, something that you actually want to do in your sex life. So a fantasy could be a desire, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes a fantasy is just a fantasy.
Totally.
And then on top of that, we have sexual behavior, which is what you actually physically do in person with one or more other people. And your sexual behavior could have a basis in fantasy, but oftentimes the behaviors we engage in, maybe a partner suggests something at the spur of the moment, you've never thought about it before, but you engage in it anyway. So you can engage in behaviors that have never previously been fantasies or desires, but then after you engage in them, it might become a future fantasy or desire. So fantasy, desire, behavior, they're all separate things. They overlap, but there's not a one-to-one correspondence between them.
A fantasy could be something that you had happen one time and then you're replaying it or fantasizing about it after.
Yeah. So sometimes our fantasies are based on past actual experiences that we've had. And so there can also be like this component of nostalgia to them.
Sure.
Or maybe we're looking back on this positive experience and reliving it and enjoying it.
Right. Absolutely. I think that something I talk about is like there are certain desires and fantasies that I've had that then upon the actual act, I learn, oh, that's not the case, you know, and you can kind of put it in your little box. But, you know, a lot of people will come to me and other people in the space asking for advice on how to go about this new act or how do we try this new thing. And it's like, you might not enjoy it and you might have to have that neutral or negative experience to realize that.
I would say it's often the case that we don't know what we like sexually until we try it.
Totally.
There's a process of trial and error involved. And sometimes you'll try things and find that it's not for you.
Yep.
But also in the case of fantasies, when you go to act on a fantasy, sometimes you have to try it a few times to get it just right.
Definitely.
I think practice often makes perfect when it comes to fantasies.
Yeah.
So for example, in the case of threesomes, you know, it's the single most common fantasy that emerged in my research. I also found it was the fantasy that was least likely to turn out well when people actually had a threesome.
So, yes.
And there were some people who said, oh, I would never do that again because it was such a terrible experience that first time. But then other people would say, well, yeah, the first time wasn't so great, but then we recalibrated, we tried it again under different circumstances, had better communication around it, and then it was great. And so there's a learning curve when it comes to all these things.
That's a great point. I feel like I've heard a lot of, yes, negative first threesome stories that then it was like, I don't think we're going to do that again. But I mean, if you're a couple bringing in a third, it's very vulnerable, tedious territory that you're exploring. And so it makes sense that a little bit of practice would be required.
Because people don't have a script for how things go with 3 people or more people, who's
and then you're dealing with
what?
2 people that have a dynamic already. Like there's so much there. Yeah. What are some of the other biggest common fantasies?
So there were really 7 major themes that emerged. Multi-partner sex was the most popular one.
Sure.
So sex with more than 2. Let's just say. The next was power, control, and rough sex. So anything falling under the umbrella of kink and BDSM, a lot of eroticization of power play and power differentials, mixing pleasure and pain, rough sex, and so forth. Next was the novelty and adventure category, which was just kind of taking sex and putting it in an environment or situation that just is exciting and different for you. Oftentimes that was just having sex in a place other than your own bed, right? Because it actually turns out that in your own bed is actually the single most common place people fantasize about having sex. And so in these novelty fantasies, they're often mixing it up and visiting an exotic location or in public, semi-public sex, right? Where there's a risk of being caught.
I'm like, no wonder I like hotels. I'm like, okay.
Hotels are another very popular setting for fantasies as well.
That's interesting. I'm trying to think about when I fantasize about stuff, if I'm in my own, and I think I am. It's kind of a funny thought.
Well, that's a whole other thing we could talk about if you wanted to, because when I conducted the research, I did ask people whether they appear in their own fantasies. And most people do most of the time, but most people also change themselves in some way. So who we are in our fantasies is often different from who we are in reality. And I think that's very interesting psychologically.
That is interesting. I also have voyeuristic tendencies. And so it's funny that when I think of my fantasies, I'm like watching myself. I'm not like in my body. I'm like watching the scene and I'm separate. So I'm sure there's some divide there as well.
So this was actually a blind spot for me when I was conducting the research, because there's not a ton of research out there on fantasies, especially not that goes into great depth and detail about how fantasies are experienced. And I had kind of assumed that everyone saw their fantasies the same way that I saw them.
Totally.
And so I actually see my fantasies the same way as you, from this third person perspective, where I'm watching myself as like a character in a movie. And it's the same way when I dream, where I'm in a movie and I'm watching myself. I hadn't thought about it when I was doing the research initially, but I did a Twitter poll one day and asked people, how do you see yourself in your fantasy? And found that people are very split, where some people have that first person POV perspective.
Right.
Some people have the third person perspective. Some people have fantasies where they switch back and forth between different perspectives.
Ooh, wow.
Some people are like an omniscient narrator of fantasy.
Like, what's that movie with Will Ferrell?
So it's, people experience their fantasies in different ways.
Sure, that makes sense.
Most commonly, we see ourselves either through that third person or like the first person, like POV, like you're in a virtual reality game.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. Okay, so there were 7, you said.
Yes. Okay. So returning to the fantasies, 4th was taboo and forbidden sex. So basically anything that you're told by your culture, society, or religion that you're not supposed to do.
Okay.
Which could be a lot of things.
Can we get some examples?
Well, and so here's where it's important to mention that these themes can overlap in some ways, right? So multi-partner sex, is one of the themes, but it can also be taboo for someone.
Absolutely.
And it could have a kinky element as well, right?
Yes.
So these are broad themes that can be combined in different ways.
Right.
But taboos can involve lots of different things when it comes to sex. I would say oftentimes they were things that fell into more sorts of fetish kinds of categories.
Sure.
Things that would typically be considered paraphilias in the world of psychiatry and psychology.
What does paraphilia mean?
Paraphilia is a term that refers to unusual or uncommon sexual interests. And so things like exhibitionism, voyeurism, fetishism, all that stuff tends to fall in that taboo category.
Okay.
Next, we have the passion and romance fantasies, which are all about the
wholesome
emotional fulfillment. I would say the most common one in that category was wanting to be wanted. So just feeling desired by your partner.
It speaks to like a broader thing, I think.
And it's extraordinarily common across genders, across sexual orientations. Wow. Men in their fantasies often want to feel desired.
Totally.
Even though they might not necessarily always come out and say that.
Yeah.
But for example, if you'll look at their threesome fantasies, they want to be the center of attention. They want to be overwhelmingly desired by multiple other people who make them feel sexually confident and competent and wanted, right? And so at the root of a lot of these fantasies, even something like a threesome, is often that just wanting to be desired by someone else.
And wanting, I think, too, enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Because I think that people specifically in long-term partnerships can start to feel like there's a lot of routine to the sexual activity. And I've seen that in some polls, not academically studied polls, but like that my friend has done. Just in terms of like enthusiasm is the biggest thing. Wanting to just really, truly see that your partner wants to be there.
Yeah. And a big part of these passion and romance fantasies too is also just the passionate, the intimate connection.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes for people in relationships, their partner is the person they fantasize about most often, but they're often fantasizing about the early days of their relationship when they had that kind of intense feeling of passion and connection with them. Because we know it doesn't tend to last over time.
Okay, the fantasies kind of remain the honeymoon phase sex. Interesting.
Now, there were a couple of other categories. Next was non-monogamy fantasies, different from the multi-partner because it's not about like 3 people in bed at the same time or having an orgy. It's just about having the ability to have more than one sexual or romantic relationship at the same time.
Sure.
So sometimes this took the form of straight up infidelity. Other times it took the form of having an open relationship or trying swinging or cuckolding or something else. And then lastly were the sexual and gender exploration fantasies where people were sort of pushing the boundaries or limits of their own sexual identity or gender identity in some way.
Okay.
So for example, a heterosexually identified woman who fantasizes about a same-sex experience or a cisgender person who fantasizes about cross-dressing, things like that.
Sure. Wow, that's fascinating. Was the group of people, were they a certain age range or was it like, I don't know a whole lot about how research is done, but I'd love to learn more.
Well, I surveyed people ranging in age from 18 to 88.
Oh, wow.
So this was people all across the lifespan from all different political backgrounds, geographic backgrounds. They were all from the U.S., but I had people from all 50 states.
Cool.
Different economic, racial, sexuality, gender backgrounds. It was a very diverse sample. It wasn't a representative sample of the population, but it was a very diverse sample.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, the non-monogamy category, and that's why I asked about the age, just thinking about how many people are curious about that these days. But you said infidelity is included in that, or just a fantasy? Well,
so in the non-monogamy category, that could include infidelity or some type of consensual non-monogamy. And actually, I distinguished between that in the research and found that it was more common for people to have consensual non-monogamy fantasies than it was to fantasize about infidelity.
Oh, look at us.
So
people, progressive.
It makes sense that, people are more drawn to the idea of, I would like to be able to have more than one sexual partner, but I would like to do it without having to sneak around and hurt my partner or something like that.
Okay, that's good to know. Good job, guys.
And also interesting with the non-monogamy fantasies, there seems to be like a life course to our fantasies. And so I looked at how these different categories seem to evolve and change over time. So do people at different decades of life have different fantasies? And they do.
Sure.
And so I actually found that for younger adults, they were less likely to fantasize about non-monogamy. And as it got up into the 30s, then the 40s and 50s is where you saw the peak in non-monogamy fantasies. Okay. And then they started to decline again after that in the 60s and beyond.
It's as the decades of monogamy add up, I'm assuming. Or?
I think that's part of what's going on there.
Yeah.
Is that for many of these folks, they've been in monogamous relationships for years and years, and they're wanting something new or different, or sex has grown routine or boring for them.
Yeah. So what got you into sex research?
So my interest in sex research really began in graduate school. I was working on a PhD in social psychology, specifically studying the psychology of romantic relationships. And I was studying the factors that predicted what makes for happy, healthy relationships.
Oh, we need to talk about that after then. Great.
But there was this interesting thing that I noticed, which was that we were talking about how to make happy, healthy relationships, but no one was talking about sex.
Totally.
And so I was assigned to be the teaching assistant for a human sexuality course, and that opened my eyes to this whole world of sex research. And I'm like, how can I be studying relationships and we're not also talking about these things?
That should be researched. Right. The lack of research.
Well, and it's an interesting thing in academics where sex researchers and relationship researchers are largely two different camps. They have their own journals and their own conferences. And I kind of sit at the intersection of them. Right. And I consider myself a sex and relationship researcher. Yeah. Because all sex, even casual sex, occurs in some relational context.
Yes.
So talking about just one or the other, you're kind of missing something.
Absolutely. Interesting. So what was it that kind of sparked your interest in that class that you were a TA for?
Well, I had to teach this weekly discussion section as part of it. So the students would have their lecture 3 hours a week with the main instructor, and then 1 hour a week they would meet with me, and I had this little group of 30 students, and I was responsible for facilitating discussion on what we had been talking about in class that week, and then also answering their questions. And they asked me a bunch of questions that I didn't know the answer to, because I was a product of Catholic schools for most of my life.
Almost everyone I interview, I swear. I swear y'all end up over here.
And my undergraduate and graduate degrees were both at Catholic institutions.
Oh, wow.
I went to Catholic school for a big chunk of elementary and middle school. And so I didn't have much in the way of sex ed. And so I didn't have much in the way of answers for these questions.
What were some of the questions or themes?
Well, the single most common question I would get semester after semester when I was a TA, and also when I started teaching these courses myself, it was always about the female orgasm.
Oh.
And there were even questions.
The mysterious female orgasm.
There were a lot of questions that were like, can women even orgasm? Is that a thing? Or how does that happen? So lots and lots of questions about that topic. Okay. But they really covered the board in terms of what people asked about. But what actually got me into doing sex research was that I had a lot of questions from students about friends with benefits. And they're like, so can these relationships ever work? How do you make them work? Sounds cool, but I want to know. And I was like, I would love to be able to give you a science-based answer, but there's no research on the topic. So I ended up conducting a study on friends with benefits, publishing it in the Journal of Sex Research, and then over the next decade published multiple other studies on that topic. And that was kind of what got me into sex research. Friends with benefits is what drew me in.
It's cute because it sounds like the themes from the students were just their personal life, what was going on in their personal lives, which speaks to the stuff that needs to be researched. Does the female orgasm even exist? Wow. Lots to talk about there. I find my non-academic theory is that I feel like men, because of the amount of porn they're consuming from a very early age, think that just penetration will result in these orgasms because that's what they've seen for so long. And then what I've experienced firsthand is a lot of their own embarrassment and guilt when just their penis doesn't make an orgasm happen, which I think it's 80% of women can't have orgasms from penetrative sex. So
the numbers vary depending on the study that you consult. And but it is true that for most women, vaginal penetration alone is not what leads to orgasm. But, going back to men in terms of what they think works in terms of stimulating women, we're talking about this in a heterosexual context. Yeah. How are men expected to know this, right? Because orgasms and the clitoris are terms that are not mentioned in sex education, right?
It's not at all about pleasure.
No.
Sex ed is about fear, in my experience.
And so if you're lucky enough to even get sex ed,
right,
you're probably not even learning about these things. So then it's not surprising that people turn to porn to learn, but porn is entertainment. It's not education. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those things where men are expected to know what to do, but no one is teaching them the information they need to know. And so they have to, it's really incumbent on them to go out and find the right sources of information that are responsible and science-based and medically accurate, that are actually going to teach them what they need to know. And they don't always find those sources.
As you guys know, I've been very curious about anal play with my male partners, and I'm really excited to share Butter with you guys. Butter Wellness makes men's sexual health and wellness products, including this perineum massager. This applied on the perineum, which is between the ass and the penis of a man, can create prostate orgasms, which are very, very intense orgasms. In addition to that, this tool can also create extra blood flow that goes to the pelvic region. So if anybody has any issues with ED, this can also support with that. This is not to be inserted. This is for external use only. And you can get 20% off by going to butterwellness.com and use code SEGGS, SEGGS. My favorite Honey Playbox sex toy has to be the Joy Thrust. What is so cool about this toy is that this part vibrates and thrusts, which stimulates the G-spot, and this end stimulates the clitoris. Their products cover a massive, wide variety of experiences and desires, and the majority of them are app-enabled. So in addition to the buttons on the toys, you can adjust the intensity of the toy on an app on your phone, which makes for really fun, spicy playtime. If you're curious about trying out app-enabled sex toys, go to honeyplaybox.com and use code SEGGS, SEGGS, for 20% off of your entire order. If you are watching or listening to this, you're probably interested in sex and or kink and are curious about finding new partners to explore things with. However, it can be difficult to find those people. The thing I love about the HUD app is that it's more than just an app. They have a community, a podcast, and a ton of education. And inside of their app is a bedroom feature, so you can select all of the things you're interested in, all of the things you want to try, all the things you don't want to try, and that can be shown to potential future partners. So to learn more, go to hudapp.com/sextalk. That is hudapp.com/sextalk, SEGGSTALK. Can you think of any, besides more sex ed, can you think of any other solutions, or what kind of takeaways have you gathered when it comes to sex ed?
Well, so in other countries, they are doing it better than we are.
Yeah.
So for example, I teach study abroad courses all around the world. And one of the classes that I teach is in the Netherlands. We go to Amsterdam and we learn about how sex ed is taught there. And
oh my gosh.
In some of the classes, we've actually had the people who've created the Dutch curriculum talk to us. And they have a very different approach. So in the Netherlands, sex ed is mandatory, it's comprehensive, and it starts essentially in kindergarten. And I know when people hear kindergarten, they're like, they freak out and they're like, oh my God, you're teaching kindergartners how to put on condoms. And it's like, no, what you're teaching them is age appropriate information, what they need to know. It starts at a young age, just teaching them their own body parts so they know what the terms are. Mm-hmm. And then also how to communicate and the boundaries of bad touch, good touch, these sorts of things.
I think that is so, so important. And start learning consent at those ages.
And what the data show is that when people have that understanding of consent communication and they have the language for what their body parts are, they're actually safer in the sense of they're able to report sexual assault or abuse or things that are going on
right.
that might otherwise go unreported, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of value in
Wow.
starting with this age-appropriate education. But
Yeah.
getting back to the approach that they teach in the Netherlands, as they get older, they learn more of, the mechanics and what they need to know about sex.
Mm-hmm.
But they also talk about pleasure and consent and communication.
Wow.
And how does this all work? And how do you navigate difficult situations? Like, let's say your partner doesn't want to use a condom, but you do. Like, how do you manage those kinds of difficult conversations?
Which just feels so logical. And
it does.
Like sane.
And I don't see what should be controversial about that,
I know.
but the fact that they're teaching about these things, I couldn't help but be struck by it, because I'm like, we would never have these conversations in sex ed in the U.S.
My concern is that if any pleasure element was brought into the conversation, there would be people that would come for this is promoting sex, premarital sex. It's whatever the argument would be.
But that's the thing that always happens, is that anything that is meant to enhance even safety when it comes to sex
and reduce harm
gets labeled by a certain segment of the population as you're endorsing or promoting or encouraging promiscuity.
Right.
We heard about this with the HPV vaccine, which is like 99% effective in terms of preventing cervical and lots of other very devastating cancers. And there were all these arguments against mandatory vaccination for adolescents for this vaccine, because they were like, well, that's just going to license them to be promiscuous and have a lot of sex. We all said at the time, that's bullshit. It's not going to happen. And now we actually have the data to say, you know what? The adolescents, the teens who got that vaccine were no more sexually active, and they're safer as a result of having had that. And there were
less cases of HPV, I'm sure. Was there any correlation or studying of have they compared sexual assault crime rates in the Netherlands versus here, or versus countries without comprehensive sex ed?
Off the top of my head, there is some data I can think of in the US where they've compared the efficacy of comprehensive versus abstinence-based programs.
I've heard of this, yeah.
Right? And one of the things they have looked at in the research is how is that related to sexual assault or abuse. And what we actually see is that for students who receive comprehensive sex ed, they're less likely to report having experienced sexual assaults or sexual violence. And it may be because within their circle, if everybody's learning about consent, communication, and all these other things, that then reduces the rate at which those things happen.
Yeah. It also makes me think about the relationship for Americans with alcohol versus Europe. Not being able to drink until we're 21 and having it be this, like, for me, when I went to college, a fucking free-for-all. And now I'm sober. Like, it's when things are just treated as normal, as I think, a teenager's relationship with drinking is in the EU, there's not such an extreme go all in for it. Whereas, abstinence only sex education, it's like, and maybe you can speak to this with fantasies, when something is so like repressed and you're not allowed to do it, it becomes even more like desirable.
Well, and I think that's precisely why taboos are one of the biggest themes in people's fantasies. It's because what you're told you aren't supposed to do,
so naughty,
becomes tantalizing, right? It's something that sex therapist Jack Moran called the erotic equation, which basically meant attraction plus obstacles equals excitement, right? So if you have even the slightest inkling of an attraction towards something, and then you're told you can't do it or you can't pursue it, that makes it exciting and makes us want to try it even more.
This is hitting home, yes.
But it's also like reverse psychology. Any parent who has kids knows that if you tell them not to do something, that just makes them even more likely to do it. This applies in so many contexts of our lives, but certainly in the area of sex.
Wow. Well, I really hope to go on one of your trips next year, because I am very curious about what people's relationship with sex looks like in Europe, and what people's relationship and understanding of sex work looks like, and just, definitely want to get over there and open up to new things.
And anybody who wants to come is welcome.
Yes.
So I teach these courses through the Sexual Health Alliance, and I believe our 2025 courses will take us to Amsterdam, to Prague, to Reykjavik, Iceland, as well as Barcelona. So you can come
on the same trip?
It's going to be split, where Amsterdam and Prague will be in the spring, and then Iceland and Barcelona will be in the fall.
Okay, very cool. Very cool.
And you can come to just 1 week, or you can come to all 4 if you want to.
What is, like, Reykjavik? Is that how you say it, right? Mm-hmm. What's going on there in terms of
sex?
Yeah.
So they do have a penis museum there. That's one of the things that we will do on that trip. I was there a couple of years ago for the International Academy of Sex Research Conference.
Cool.
And we actually had a big formal event at the penis museum. And they have penis specimens from all animal species from all over the world. It's kind of a creepy place in some ways, but it's interesting.
I like creepy shit.
Yeah.
Sounds fascinating. I saw Jimi Hendrix's casted penis today.
They have that there at the Penis Museum. They have a cast of it. And then they also
I just looked at it in the library, I think.
Well, they have a cast of it at the Penis Museum in Iceland, I know for sure.
Okay, interesting. Oh, did I see a replica?
It might be. Maybe there's more than one. It is legendary.
Fascinating. Okay, so they have the Penis Museum, but is there...
So it's also an interesting sexual culture, so this is one of the things we talk about in the courses is we want to understand the local culture. And one thing that's interesting about Iceland that I learned on my last trip was that it's the only country I know of where they actually have this app where if you're interested in dating someone, you can check to see first if you're related to that person before you go out on a date and have accidental incest.
Okay.
Because the population in Iceland is so small that the odds of you being related to someone are going to be much higher than in a more populous country. Yeah. And so it is actually like a concern that somebody that you might meet and become romantically interested in could be a relative of yours.
Ancestry.com.
Right. So it's like an incest avoidance app, right?
Fascinating.
And this is one of the things I find that's fascinating about these courses is, just learning about how sex is different around the world and relationships. And, we'll meet with local sex educators there. We also learn from folks in the local kink and BDSM scene. So one of the things we're going to try and do in the Iceland course is a build your own flogger class.
Oh my gosh, fun. Wow, that is very cool. So what are some of the other wildest things you've experienced on some of these trips?
I mean,
or biggest takeaways?
They're all so interesting in their own way. I would say, honestly, for me, one of the most rewarding things about teaching the classes is just the learning experience it presents to students. So I actually started teaching these classes first for college students, and now it's open to professionals and also anyone who just wants to come along.
Love that.
And when I was teaching them for college students, some of the students that I was taking had never been to another country before. They'd never been on an airplane.
Oh.
And so taking them from Indiana to Amsterdam was a life-changing experience for them. And, as a part of these courses, you have to learn to become self-sufficient in a foreign city where you don't speak the language, right? So you've got that personal growth and learning experience.
Definitely.
But then they're also learning about and totally changing their perspective on human sexuality.
Yeah.
So I will ask people in my courses to reflect on certain questions and topics before they go, essentially journal about it, and then journal again afterwards. Well, journal while they're there, and then also when they come home about how has their perspective changed or shifted. And, if they're a sex therapist in training, how is this going to change the way that they might interact with clients in the future? And, sex work is one of those areas where I saw really big shifts among my students where
if their perception of it,
if you would look at the pre-trip essays, you would see a lot of anti-sex work bias and thinking no one would ever choose this profession. It's inherently victimizing and psychologically damaging. And then we go and they meet with actual sex workers who are working in a culture where it's legal and who have voluntarily chosen to do this as a career. And it totally changes their perspective on what being a sex worker can look like and what it
Yeah.
can mean and how it can be an empowering choice for some people
Yeah.
and how some people can enjoy the career.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons I would want to go along, is to show a bit of that and talk to people that are willing to share their stories. I think it's a double-sided coin. I think there can absolutely be, a situation where people are victims and, bad things can happen in that space. But if people aren't talking about it publicly, then nobody knows the truth. And so about 6 months into my podcast, I opened up about having done it myself. And it just it was really hard to do because of fear of judgment. And then I just realized there's so many stories to share, and it's been extremely empowering in my life. I was recently giving a blowjob to a partner, and one of the things that I love incorporating into all types of play is lube. But specifically with blowjobs, I love being able to use this honeydew flavor of mochi melt because it makes it so much more fun and delicious for both parties. I also enjoy using it for penetrative sex, and in the past, I found that I can't really use flavored lube down there because it could upset my pH. However, mochi melt is pH balanced, it is food grade, and it is FDA approved, which makes it completely safe for use down there for the ladies and the fellas. If you want to try out Mochi Melt, go to mochimelt.com and use code Thea, THEA, for 15% off of your entire order. I recently squirted for the first time, and it was a lot of fluid. I was surprised. I squirted 5 times in a row the first time I did it, and everything was drenched. I spent the entire next day doing multiple loads of laundry, and as excited as I was to have squirted for the first time, I also realized that I needed a solution for the problem at hand. So I am so excited to be working with Splash Blanket. They create incredible waterproof blankets. They can be used for squirting, for sex in general. They absorb up to 1 liter of liquid. I mean, I just use mine as a cozy blanket. They are extremely diverse, and I absolutely love them. So go to splashblanket.us and use code SEGGS, SEGGS, for 15% off of your entire order.
And, it's one of those areas where I think it's hard for people to get reliable or accurate information about sex workers and the sex work industry, because even the scientific literature is very ideological, right? There are many people who have published on sex work that say it's always bad. It's always, that says every sex worker is a victim, and that they equate sex work with sex trafficking.
Right.
And, you'll see that, but then you'll also see other writings where it just describes sex work as empowering and only talks about the positive side of it. And the truth with sex work is that it's somewhere in the middle. There's a lot of variability in people's experiences.
Right.
Yes, there is abuse and exploitation that can happen, but it can also be an empowering choice for some people, and some people like and enjoy the career. And so, for me, with the science of sex, whether it's about sex work or pornography or anything, you have to acknowledge the positive side of things and also the negative side. And I think being sex positive means that you're not just acknowledging the positive, but you're talking about everything in its nuance and detail.
Complexity. Yeah. There can be a lot of judgment there. And the word sex work now encompasses internet sex work. So it's a very broad, and then there's what they call the hierarchy, or I think there's other words for it, but it's some people are at obviously higher risk of having issues.
And and that's one of the issues with the term sex work, is that it is so broad that when you're talking about sex workers as you can't talk about them as a monolith, because their experiences are so highly variable depending upon what's the environment in which they work in. Are they working online from home and never face to face with customers? Are they working literally on the streets? Are they in escort that works with a select client list? Do they work in a brothel setting? Are they working in a culture where it's legal or where it's illegal? All of these things.
It almost feels harmful to Yeah.
To put it all under the same umbrella
Right.
is, I think, problematic in some
Absolutely.
ways. Because you can't talk about them as...
But then even all of the other, even just saying, an escort versus sugar dating versus a brothel. I mean, everybody gets these like this vivid imagery of each of those things that has a negative connotation. So...
And, it's also partly for this. It's also partly for this reason that there are some people who are doing sex work objectively, but who don't consider themselves to be sex workers.
Totally.
And so that's a whole other thing. It's just, it's a complicated subject to talk about.
Yeah, it is.
And also to research, in part because, as I said, there's a lot of ideology that's built into that. So finding people who are willing to have like open, nuanced discussions about a complex topic is sometimes a tall order. Yeah,
definitely. So it sounds like you've done some recent research on the Gen Zers, who I love. It's funny when you think you're cool and then another generation comes along, and now I have a Gen Z assistant, and it's just like, in my experience, they seem very sex positive and open-minded. But I would love to hear kind of some of your findings or perceptions.
So this was research I did in collaboration with the dating app Field. And they're a dating app for the open-minded and curious, right?
Only place I date.
And so what we wanted to do was try and understand differences in the way that people from different generations are approaching sex and dating. And specifically, we did this by surveying thousands of members on Field.
Oh, I've gotten the little surveys. That was you.
It might have been for me. And so, we looked at lots of different things. Okay. But some of the key takeaways, one was we looked at relationship style. And so what kind of relationships do people at different stages of life seem to want or are drawn to?
But wouldn't these all be relatively kinky, open-minded people?
Well, so this is where it gets interesting, right? So we asked people for their preferred relationship style, and we gave them, I believe, 16 different options to choose from. And it was fascinating that among Gen Zers, people roughly under the age of 18 to 27, right, would be the age range for Gen Z. Monogamy was the single most preferred relationship style for Gen Zers.
Okay.
Whereas for millennials and Gen X, it was open relationship. And for boomers, it was actually friends with benefits. So it's interesting, not necessarily what you would expect, but I find it fascinating that young adults seem to be so interested in monogamy. And I see the same thing in my fantasy research. So if I look at fantasies about monogamy versus non-monogamy,
the age.
Yeah, they follow that time course where it's young adults are more open to monogamy. Midlife adults tend to be the most open to ethical non-monogamy.
Why do you think that is?
So it's a great question. And I think part of it is that, a majority of Gen Z is single. Many of them have never had a relationship or never had like a long-term serious committed relationship, let alone multiple relationships at the same time.
Yeah.
And so maybe they're not fantasizing as much or are as interested in non-monogamy because they're just focused on having a relationship as opposed to many.
More single than millennials were at the same age ranges?
So Gen Z is the most single and least sexed generation to date. So if we look at data on how much sex Gen Z is having compared to generations past, they're having less sex with fewer partners. I see this in my data. I see this in other data sets based on nationally representative surveys. Like, they're just not having as much sex, and they're not having as much in the way of relationships either. There's also this sort of romanticization of traditional relationships among Gen Z, right? So we can talk about how Gen Z is also like very kinky and like very expansive in terms of sexuality and gender.
Yes.
But in terms of relationship values and ideals, they're a blend. Like, certainly many Gen Zers are interested and open to non-monogamy.
Yeah. But
we're also seeing a large contingent of them that wants monogamy and more traditional kinds of relationships. It's why, paradoxically, at the same time that you have a lot of Gen Zers who are like, advocates for polyamory, you have others who are advocates for like their trad wives, or, you know, so it's kind of like they're a complex generation in terms of their relationship values. And I think part of it is that for young adults, like, who haven't had as much experience with dating and where they've grown up only with online dating.
Yeah.
Which can be like...
I was just going to ask if we can blame this on technology.
I mean, in online dating, it can be great. It works for some people. I met my partner online. We've been together, Jesus, this is 25 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we met in like Wild West days of the the internet, before dating apps even existed.
You look young, I think.
I married a skin doctor, so, you know, that helps.
There you go.
But yeah, so, you know, online dating can work. It can also be accessible. And certain apps don't lend themselves to...
I'm not just thinking of dating, though. I'm thinking of Gen Z and the inundation of their whole life being on technology. So like when I was, I think 13, 14, I got my first phone, and it was a block like Nokia phone that had Snake on it. And I think I got an iPhone like when they first came out later in high school, but it wasn't like consuming my life in the way that it does now. Granted, I also like live on social media for a living, but it was such a different relationship with technology. And so imagining a generation that's just had that experience of phones and iPhones and iPads, and here, like, I don't think it's just the dating apps. I think it's the like the sexting and the Instagram, and they can consume a lot of like sensual and sexual content without having the experience.
Right. I mean, there is that, but there's also, just with online interactions in general, catfishing and scammers and ghosting and all these other sorts of things that can make it feel toxic or hopeless because you've had so many bad interactions. And so, you know, another thing we're seeing with Gen Z is also a rise in celibacy. Like, a lot of them are just choosing to opt out of sex and dating, at least for now, because while being single can be a struggle, pursuing love and relationships and sex can be an even bigger struggle.
That felt like an attack. Yes. I'm pretty tired of it. And I'm at a point personally where I'm just like, less effort, less swiping, less just like letting things happen, because it can totally be exhausting.
And that's why I did an episode on my podcast recently where we talked about mindful swiping, right? Okay. And how if you're going to engage in online dating, like it's important to set limits and boundaries so that it doesn't
but it's so addictive. But it's a dopamine trap.
You have to have the self-discipline. Yeah. Because otherwise it will just take over your life. I'm
an ADHD swiper. Yeah, that's really interesting about Gen Z. Camila and I were talking about, she brought up a really interesting point of like the ebbs and flows of society, basically on a broader scale, of like expansion and contraction. And I almost feel like I am hearing a similar theme with generations. Like if the generations that were partying and having sex and doing crazy stuff in the 60s, then maybe their kids are a bit more conservative. And then maybe their kids are, it's kind of this, I don't want to say we're all rebelling against our parents, but, maybe there is some generational kind of flip-flopping. I don't know.
Sexuality, and I talk about this in my textbook. I have a book called The Psychology of Human Sexuality. It just came out in its 3rd edition. It's a textbook used in college classrooms around the world to learn all about the science of sex. Like
in the same classrooms that you TA'd in? Like that kind of class?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
I wrote
that for you.
the book that I would have used back then if I was a TA.
Awesome.
Or an instructor. But one of the things I talk about in that book is how sexuality is something that always swings on this pendulum, and how when you look across different historical periods, you find periods marked by greater sexual openness and more sexual liberalism, and then it's sort of quickly followed by a return to more conservatism. Right. But the pendulum keeps shifting, right? So for example, if you think about the sexual revolution in the US in the 1960s and 70s, the 80s and 90s were this return to a lot of conservative sexual values, especially, during the AIDS crisis. And, that was a big reason for a lot of the shift in attitudes.
It created a lot of fear and judgment.
Yes.
I think. And that was 80s primarily?
80s and early 90s.
Oh, really? Wow.
And,
okay.
you know, toward the end of the 90s and early 2000s, like we started to have this swing back toward more openness and I guess you could say more liberal sexual values. And if, for example, if you look at Gallup polls over the last 20 years, you see that by so many metrics, Americans have become more and more and more sexually liberal, you know, and that sort of culminated or peaked around 2015, 2016, you know, after same-sex marriage was legalized throughout the country. And
it peaked. Meaning are we getting more conservative?
We're reversing, right? So acceptance of same-sex relationships and support for LGBTQ rights, it's still, you know, at these historic highs, but it's starting to drop. And so, you know,
yet there's so many people on field, and it's like kind of extremes. Feels very extreme.
But I feel like we are at one of those inflection points where we're kind of going back toward, or at least certain segments of society are embracing a lot more conservative sexual attitudes and values. And, you know, you see this in the public opinion polls when you look at support for certain issues. You can see it in political candidates that people might be supporting. You can see it in data in terms of like what people are doing in their sex lives, and, you know, with the rise in celibacy, and you see it on social media with the rise in trad wives and all this other stuff. Like these things aren't happening in isolation. Traditional wives, right? So it's a whole phenomenon on social media of women who are embracing
out of the loop.
These very traditional conservative roles in their relationships.
Okay. I was thinking something different. Okay. Wow. I need to do a TikTok deep dive. I've heard about it, but hadn't gone down too many rabbit holes there. Interesting. We're getting more. Yeah.
But that's the thing that I think makes it difficult to predict the future of sex is because, you know, it's easy to sort of look at like, what are the trends now? And then, you know, for example, people today are kinkier seemingly than they've ever been. We know kink isn't new, but
it's not. I looked at some photos of it from the 40s. And it was cool.
By a lot of metrics, like young adults, like especially, are kinkier than ever. And some people might make the prediction that, well, future generations are just going to continue to become even kinkier. But what you have to recognize is, again, that's that pendulum shift. And at some point it stops and the trend reverses. Yeah. And it's always hard to predict when that's going to happen.
Sure. Do you know off the top of your head about like sex ed in the United States, like just how it works? Like I know it's state by state, and how do the schools get programs? Like I'm just kind of curious about how that works.
It's a patchwork of laws. So it's
different in each state, or
it is state by state. There's no federal requirement for sex education. So I believe as of this year, there's still 20 or 21 states where there's not even a requirement for sex ed to be taught. In the 28, 29 states where it is required, it's highly variable in terms of like at the state level, what is required to be taught. And, you know, of the states that require sex ed to be taught, only half of them require that it's medically accurate. Right?
What?
Which is crazy.
What are they teaching in the not medically accurate ones?
Whatever the fuck they want.
What do you mean?
That's the problem with a lot of sex ed.
Not medically accurate. Does that mean it could be like...
It means you have to teach something, but we don't care what you're teaching.
Wow. I'm really curious what's in those
but that's
non-medically accurate textbooks.
Well, it's why so many of us get shitty sex ed, and why we can remember not learning anything accurate or useful, because in a large number of states, you're required to have sex ed, but they don't have to teach you anything that you actually need to know.
And this might be controversial, but somebody was talking to me about, you know, the issue of putting, you know, preteens and recently pubescent kids, men, like boys and girls, in the same sex ed class. And I kind of do agree, reflecting back on it, that I think it would have been more beneficial if we'd been separated, because it was teasing and it was jokes. And there's no fucking way I could have asked like an actual sex question. You know, it wouldn't have been a safe space because people are flying paper airplanes and like, I don't know. It was just, I remember just chaos. And I remember one exercise, which was basically a condom spreading glitter STIs, fear-based. That's all I remember.
All I remember mine was I was so excited on the day that we were going to learn about sex.
The one day? No.
The day, yes.
The day.
And they separated the boys and the girls. And this is in the 5th grade. And I pulled out my notebook and I wrote sex ed really big at the top of the page. And I was ready.
Did you find it?
I was ready to take notes.
Did you find that recently or like?
No, but
you just remember.
I have like a flashbulb memory of it because it was like something I was so excited for.
Wow.
But then by the time the class was over, I realized I hadn't written anything. Like I somehow knew less.
There's no takeaways.
It was confusing. Like they just had like diagrams up and stuff. And
yes.
like
I remember learning about like I'm just trying to think of some different glands. I don't know. Like it's very anatomical.
Yeah, but I don't remember.
The Van Deferens, that's what it is.
I don't remember anything I learned except for the girls got goodie bags and we didn't. And I was very upset about that.
What were in their goodie bags?
Well, they got tampons and stuff.
Oh.
Well, I didn't know that at the time, but I was like, why do they get presents?
What's in the sex ed bag?
Where's my swag bag?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And so like the dream of there being pleasure even involved in this when we don't even have sex ed in half the states it's a long shot. I'm curious what the data is on sexual assault crimes in the states with no sex ed versus I might have to look into that. I'm curious. Because I mean, it's kind of like, I think that there's research out there about condom use. If there is condom promotion and sex ed, there's less, when they do the abstinence thing, more teens are getting pregnant.
In the states that have the most abstinence programs, they have the highest teen pregnancy rates. Right?
Much more eloquent. Thank you. Yeah. I live, what was it? Maybe like 2 weeks, I think, after I moved to Texas is when Roe versus Wade got overturned. And it was just a really strange experience to be living in Texas, actually going through that. I've always struggled with birth control. It's never worked for my mental health. And so really like realizing and feeling like scared. So it was a weird experience.
It was a really weird experience when I had to recently revise the 3rd edition of my textbook. Where I had the whole section on abortion, where I had to change the section where I said,
"Wow,
abortion as of the Dobbs v. Jackson decision and the specific date of it is no longer legal throughout the United States." And it's like, it was not a sentence I ever expected to write.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, it's I can't. I want to help with sex education in the United States, but it's overwhelming because I'm not sure where to start.
So for people who want to help promote better sex ed, the best way to do this is to get involved at the local level, because that's actually where most decisions are made in terms of like what curriculum people are going to use.
Oh, okay.
So if you're a parent, get involved with your school, learn what your kids are going to be learning, get involved with parent-teacher associations and things like that.
Sure.
So that you can try and have a say in what your kids are going to be taught. Because if you don't do it, you can imagine voices on the other side are going to come in and say we shouldn't be teaching it at all, or we should only be teaching abstinence and so forth. So schools need to recognize that parents want comprehensive sex ed. If you survey people and ask them what do they want, by and large, most Americans across the political spectrum, regardless of religious background and so forth, most of them want comprehensive sex ed.
Wow.
It's only a relatively small minority who want the strict abstinence programs, like 15 to 20% or so, but they have enormous sway and power in terms of influencing what is actually taught.
Yes.
And so that's where it's important that you make your voice heard. And at the local level is really the best way to try and affect action, and also recognize if you have kids, you need to fill in the gaps for them.
Totally.
And if you're not comfortable having the talk, seek support and resources. There are lots of wonderful books out there. I have many episodes on my podcast where I've interviewed sex educators who have written these kinds of books and who can give you practical tips on how to have the talk with your kids.
Yeah. Do you know which episode numbers those are of yours, or which
So
guests?
there's more than 300 episodes
Okay,
off the top of my head. But one of the episodes that comes to mind
Yeah.
is with Lene St. John. She's a sex educator, and she wrote a book on how to have the talk with your kids and came on the
Awesome.
show to talk about practical tips. So I would recommend checking out her book and also checking out our podcast episode of the Sex and Psychology podcast. But you can also just search through episodes on my website, sexandpsychology.com, where there are many episodes on and also blog posts on what you need to know if you're a parent in terms
Sure.
of how to have healthy conversations with your kids about this stuff.
That's one thing I noticed looking into some of the stuff you've done. You're doing a lot.
Yeah. I often describe myself as a promiscuous sex researcher because I don't just study one thing.
Sure. Bounce around.
There's so many questions that I think are important to answer. And
Yeah.
I think there's value. Traditional academics will often just study one thing in
Yes.
increasingly greater depth over the course of their careers. And I can't imagine anything
No.
more boring. So I study a lot of different topics. And also as a sex educator, you kind of got to cover it all. I don't just want to be a sex educator for one small sliver of the population. I want,
Right.
because everyone is a sexual being in some way. And, for example, on my show, we have episodes on asexuality and episodes on LGBTQ issues, episodes that gear more toward men, some more toward women, dealing with sex, dealing with relationships, safer sex, sexual violence. We have to cover it all. Definitely.
Earlier we were chatting a little bit about sex research. Have you encountered issues with conducting research? A bias that a university might have, or have you encountered issues with that heard?
The single biggest issue that I've encountered is that it's very hard to get funding to do sex research, right? So if you have a study you want to do,
seek out funding.
If you want to do any kind of nationally representative survey or anything where you've got high-tech equipment or so forth, you need to have funding for it, or you need to pay participants and so forth. And if you can't get funding for research, it's very hard to do good quality work. And as a sex researcher, it is hard to get money to do sex research.
That's important to share, I think.
And, one of the other issues is that I haven't personally experienced much of this, but I know many other researchers who have, is that they're working at institutions that are not supportive of their work. They might trivialize it or not see the value in it, or in some cases discourage them from doing that and push them toward quote unquote safer topics to study. Yeah.
Well, the work you're doing is super, super important. And I'm glad you're bouncing around because we need that. So it's been really lovely chatting today. And what is your Instagram handle again so people can come hang out?
Yeah, people can follow me on Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, all the things. And you can find me on my website, sexandpsychology.com, where you can also find links to my books and my podcast and all the other stuff I'm doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the episode today. Be sure to stay in touch with us on socials at Sex Talk Radio Podcast. That is SEGGS Talk Radio Podcast.